Can I get everybody's attention, please? How's everyone enjoying lunch? Let's hear some expression. Thank you once again to Sharon and all those helping this morning. It's great. It's great to have some lunch. And once again, we're very privileged to have Steve Teekens with us. And Steve will share a little bit. We've asked him to say some things, and we'll let him introduce what he wants to speak on. We've talked about it a little bit. And then there'll be a little time for questions afterwards, okay? So let me turn that over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Harris. All right, thank you very much, Harris. So, bonjour, Jashko Jeshiwang Nabe, Manadonande, this Nakaz, Web Shishido Dem, Nibising Nudun Jaba. So, what I just said was a language I don't think any of you would understand. I spoke in Ojibwe. And what I did was I introduced myself and gave you a traditional greeting. And I said I'm from Nipissing First Nation. And I'm of the Martin clan, which my family belongs to. So I want to thank the volunteers that made the delicious lunch. I really enjoyed the gingerbread cookies. They were really nice. And thank you for the wonderful sermon today and for having me back again. I was just here last year and I was able to share a little bit about our services and what we do. So today Harris said, asked me if I could speak a little bit about reconciliation and as well as about the services that we offer. So can you hear me okay when it's like this? Okay. Yeah. So I enjoy speaking about reconciliation because it's something I think that we as Canadians can all try to push the mark forward in. And you know, I often ask people, well, what does reconciliation mean to you? I know for me, what I've seen in actions is a bunch of apologies. I've seen it's a holiday for federal employees. They get an extra long weekend. It's no changes to the boil water advisories for our First Nations communities, some of which that are not even far from Toronto, that have no clean drinking water. You know, it's a lot of underfunding for social programs that are Indigenous-led and operated. And that's just the fact and the way it is here in Canada. In Toronto, a lot of Indigenous people live here. And when I use the word Indigenous, the group that I'm describing are First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, the first peoples of this land. And they say that 80% of Indigenous peoples in the province of Ontario live off reserve. They don't live in First Nations communities. They live in urban centers like Toronto. So about almost 10 years ago, in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a report with 94 calls to action. And is anyone familiar with the 94 calls to action? Okay, a few people, that's good. Okay, so not many of those calls have been achieved. Depending on who you ask, and I read up on this a lot, I read a lot of scholarly articles, and a lot of scholars say about 11 to 13 of the calls to action have been fully achieved. That's about 83% of the 94 calls to action that still remain unfulfilled, approximately, because there's no consensus on, is it actually 11 that have been fulfilled, or is it actually 13? It's a little bit of a gray area, depending on who you ask. But no new calls to action have been realized since 2023. And if you're not familiar with the calls to action, it's a document that highlights different areas in which governments and average Canadian citizens should do to help make reconciliation happen towards Indigenous peoples. So there's different sectors. There's a sector on justice. There's a sector on child welfare. There's a sector on government. There's a whole bunch of different sectors. It's not a difficult read if you are ever curious and wish to look it up. But I know last summer I was able to get a lot of media attention, and even in September leading up to the National Day of Reconciliation. And NAMI Res, we plan an event every year at Hillcrest Park. which is just off of Christie Street, just above Davenport. And we invite members of the public and people in our neighborhood to come participate. And usually that day of reconciliation, we'll have some folks talk about different things. I used to talk about my grandparents' experiences in residential schools. I used to talk about my mother's experience being part of the adoption scoop, which took place in the late 50s and went on for quite some time, and it was all systemic, sanctioned by our federal governments. And I found after talking about those things that it was very difficult afterwards for me to deal with those things. So I find it much easier talking about the calls to action and trying to encourage people to push the mark forward. So there's about 73 calls to action that aren't really in the realm of average Canadians to push forward unless you push our politicians to make things happen. So of those 73, of those calls to action, that the majority are in the realm of government, some of which are in partnership with the federal government and territorial and provincial governments. If we push them to make those things happen a little more easier, I think the mark can be pushed forward much better. So the impetus of reconciliation, I think, came about when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission toured Canada and a lot of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and heard about people's experiences in residential schools, where they heard about a lot of the awful things that happened to them in those places, the different types of abuse that they endured. And it was just very horrific and traumatic for people to come out and share those stories. So those awful experiences that are part of our colonial history and our shared history in Canada will not define Indigenous peoples. We're strong and resilient. We have beautiful culture and beautiful ways of doing things. And if reconciliation was to be totally fulfilled, I think all Canadians would be in a better space. So that's my little piece on reconciliation for today. However, I will say what reconciliation is not. Reconciliation is not a fad. Reconciliation is not a guilt trip on other Canadians. Reconciliation is not something that is unachievable. And I have a few other things I could say it's not, but they slip my mind. And I'm horrible at reading speeches usually, so I usually speak from the heart because I find the best words always come out. So anyways, that's my little bit about reconciliation. I could go further, but I only have a little bit amount of time. So I'm going to talk about NAMI Res and the services that we offer. So I'm the executive director of NAMI Res. Most days I love my job. Some days I wonder, why the heck did I get up and come to work? Some days I deal with a lot of difficult scenarios and tragedy. Some days I have to learn to celebrate the small victories. And so at NAMI Res, we work with a lot of men that experience homelessness with a focus on Indigenous men, being First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. However, we do work with a lot of non-Indigenous men as well. At the NAMI Res shelter located on Vaughan Road, the majority of our residents are actually newcomers, they're asylum seekers, and they've come to Canada to seek a better life, just like a lot of our Indigenous residents. They come to Toronto from other First Nations communities across the country to seek a better life. And the unfortunate thing is in Toronto, there's not enough affordable housing for anyone, really. So a lot of the newcomers and a lot of the Indigenous peoples that come to our services, that come to Toronto, they have a hard time sometimes settling here because the cost of housing is so expensive. So in the realm of Indigenous homelessness, there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness. The last street needs assessment took place back in 2021. There'll be a new one coming out soon, and we're hoping the data will be shared soon. But this graph shows that in the green, that consistently since the City of Toronto has been doing street needs assessment, that the Indigenous population has been overrepresented among the homeless population. It hovers between 16 and 15% of overall, all the people that experience homelessness. And the Indigenous population overall in Toronto is barely 2% of the overall population. So it's a real travesty that Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in homelessness. The blue part of this graph shows the outdoor homeless. And of course, Indigenous peoples, again, are overrepresented in those that are experiencing outdoor homeless and not staying in a shelter. This is our organizational chart. I know it looks like traditional First Nations beadwork of a flower. And with our org chart, usually we put in the center of our org chart the clients. Those are the people that we work with, that we offer help to, and that's how we wrap around services. So often when we have our staff meetings, I'll tell our staff, the teams are represented by the petals of that flower. And we might not be the prettiest or nicest smelling flower around, but we're a mighty flower, and we help a lot of people. So some of the aspects of our org chart is our outreach services, which is our staff that go around in our vehicles and help out and assist homeless people in encampments wherever they may be, and try to help them to get housing, which has become more difficult these days because of the lack of affordable housing stock in this city. And then we have our Sagate shelter, which is a shelter strictly for Indigenous men. It's a small one. It's only 20 beds. And in that shelter, we have a lot of cultural programs. We have one called the Pindamoanin. In Ojibwe, that means having confidence in myself. And what we've noticed is a lot of people, especially Indigenous folks, they lack confidence in themselves. So we have a lot of cultural programs and life skills programs that help to instill confidence. We have financial literacy programs. We have gardening and other types of programs that help to boost their self-esteem. We also teach Ojibwe language and Cree language to our residents. Another program we have is our housing. So that's at the bottom here. And I recognized quite some time ago that the key to end homeless for people is housing. That's the cure. It's so simple. However, if you're into creating housing like NamiRes does, it's not simple. In order to, you can buy a property today, but if you want to renovate it and do things that might go up against building code, you have to go to committee of adjustment, and that takes time. And then you have to go to committee of adjustment and have a hearing. So keep the complications short of getting a building permit. I know we have one building we purchased 3 Octobers ago in the heat of the pandemic. And we just broke ground just this past October. So that's 3 years it took us to get a building permit. There's no such thing as rapid housing in Toronto because the permits process and all the regulations are so slow. It's very unfortunate, but and then we have our men's shelter, NamiRes shelter. It's 54 beds, and that's a shelter where we have a lot of folks that are experiencing homelessness come, whether they're Indigenous or not, and that's where we have the majority of our residents that are newcomers to Canada. And then we have our Minokanagoan program. In Ojibwe, Minokanagoan means looking for the good in myself. And that's an intensive case, mental health case management program that works with a lot of the Indigenous men that have severe mental health issues as well as addictions. So that's a little bit of an overview of our services. The little leaves in that org chart are some of our newer services. So we have a NILO, which is an acronym for Native Inmate Liaison Officer. And they'll work with the Native inmates in the provincial jail system and bring culture to those guys inside. And hopefully when they get out of the jail, that they'll be not experiencing homelessness and have that connection to culture and have something that can give them a bit of hope while they're inside. We also started up a health center during COVID. It's called the Doje Minno Nasewanong. In Ojibwe, that means the place of healthy breathing. And it's now morphed into an Indigenous community health center where we have Indigenous doctors and nurses that offer a variety of primary health care services to individuals that need it. So, our services are very far and wide. And often if I find a gap in services for the guys that we provide services to, I'll find a way to fill that gap, and I'll find a way to get those resources to make it happen. So I've been blessed with having quite a number of team members that are very dedicated to the work, that want to see a lot of people succeed. And here in Canada, Indigenous culture has been difficult to find for a lot of people. And at NAMI Res, we have a lot of cultural services, and it seems to work really well with our Indigenous men to help them work through the different aspects of healing that they may have to go through. There's a lot of trauma in Indigenous communities, and a lot of healing that needs to take place. So we have a staff person, they're called Ashka Bewis, and the Ashka Bewis in Ojibwe means like traditional helper. So what they do is they'll bring in different traditional people that have traditional knowledge and elders, and they'll come in and do healing circles or sweat lodge ceremonies, bring them out fasting. We'll have elders that will come in and impart some of their wisdom on some of the men that we work with. Some of the elders will even ride along in our vans and offer cultural services to those that are in encampments that are homeless. And they often give them hope. And we're finding too, when we bring the elders in our van and greet the people that are experiencing homelessness, that it breaks down barriers and helps to make trust happen a lot quicker with folks that are out there experiencing homelessness. Because for some reason, bringing an elder, I guess it just helps to break down those barriers, and it helps make providing services much easier. We also have a powwow in the summertime, and this year it's going to be on June 21st, which is really cool because that's National Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's going to take place at Fort York. Last year we had 23,000 people show up. I was really overwhelmed by the attendance. But it's a day where we showcase a lot of Indigenous culture. You'll hear traditional powwow singing on the drum. You'll hear and see different dancers dancing their different styles. Last year I was a master of ceremonies for that powwow, so I explained the significance of all the different dance styles and the teachings behind the drum and why we do the things that we do. If you're not doing anything on June 21st, you're more than welcome to come out. It's going to be crowded though, I imagine. So, just be aware of that. I know we do have special areas for our seniors. So our seniors, we'd have special seating for you right at the front, so you just get a good view. However, it does fill up fast. And then we also have another special event, which is in September 30th, which is now one of those calls to action in the TRC's recommendations. It's called the National Day of Reconciliation. And that's not a day off for us, that's a working day. And that's a day where we'll have an event at Hillcrest Park, and we'll invite members to come out and the day starts off with a sunrise ceremony in the morning at our garden, and it'll start off with ceremony. And then we'll have events. Last year, we had child-friendly events, so we had t-shirt decorating for the kids. All the guests that came were given an orange t-shirt. And we had a teepee up, and we shared teachings on the teepee and why it was such a great thing for people to live in back in the day. It was a versatile mobile home before there was mobile homes. So, if you're interested in learning more, there's opportunities too. But I think I'll cut my talk there. But I just wanted to thank you all for today. And, it was really beautiful how welcoming everyone was to me. And thank you very much for the warm welcoming.
Thank you. So Steve has very kindly agreed to answer questions, just so we allowed time for questions. So, it's good to locate where people are at and the kinds of things that are helpful to know to help fill in those gaps. So, anyone with any questions for Steve?
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much for this. This might be a tough question, but let me ask it anyway. So in the recent days, there was a lot of news coverage about the falling apart of a deal for $47 billion for child welfare. That situation. I wonder if you can share some thoughts about that and why it fell apart. Right.
Okay, well, it's a good question. I'm not an expert on it at all, but what I do know, because I was paying attention, the Assembly of First Nations, which is a group comprised of First Nations chiefs across Canada, they were offered quite a generous, seemingly generous deal from the federal government to improve the underfunding conditions of the child welfare on reserves. And it was, a big sum of money, $43 billion. 47 billion. To any of us, that's a lot of money. But there's about 537 First Nations communities across Canada, even though that seems like a lot of money. A lot of that money probably would have been stuck within the administration of Indigenous Services Canada, as a lot of First Nations programs and services do. It's usually the lawyers that seem to siphon away a lot of that money for their legal fees and everything else. So at the end of the day, only a small percentage of those dollars would make it to the First Nations communities. And at the end of it, I don't think it would have achieved all the gains in child welfare that they were hoping for. So, you never hear people complain about the child welfare services that are offered in Ontario or the budget amount that they offer. Or if you want to make maybe a population comparison, I know the population of New Brunswick is similar to the First Nations population across Canada in terms of numbers. You never hear people complain about the amount of funds that are given to the government of New Brunswick for child welfare services, whereas I guess our First Nations leaders, they saw enough policy issues with the child welfare budget, even though it was $47 billion, that it wasn't necessarily all the things that they had asked for. And it's indicative of a lot of Indigenous legislation, usually from the federal government. It's still the old attitude where the non-Indigenous policymakers seem to think they know what's good for us, whereas if they had consulted First Nations people and asked them what they thought would be good, I'm sure they would have come up with a lot of positive recommendations because they have the know-how to deliver those services within those communities. Whereas a lot of policymakers based in Ottawa, I doubt that very few of them have ever stepped into a reserve. I don't think they would go to First Nations where you can't drink the water. So it's unfortunate.
Other questions? There's a few here. Let's start here.
Thanks, Steve. I actually have two questions. In terms of the availability of fresh water on reserves, for all of Canada, what would be the balance there? How many locations would have access to drinking water? The other thing I'm curious about, the traditional medicines, I'm wondering if you could give one or two examples of what those might be and how they're used. Thanks.
All right. So, well, the fresh drinking water problem, I know in my community they had a boil water advisory for a short period of time. It was, they were able to fix the problem. But there's a First Nation community just north of here called Scugog First Nation. They're a nice little community. They're very small. They've had a boil water advisory for probably about 10 years. Another community just north of Wyerton, Cape Croker, they've had a boil water advisory now for about 4 years. I know they're putting new infrastructure in now. A lot of the issues in those communities are aging infrastructure, as well as a lot of the water treatment plants. It's older plants where A lot of the mechanical systems in there haven't been kept up to date. And a lot of these resources, they come from Indigenous Services Canada. And for whatever reason, there never seems to be enough funds, or there's too many bureaucrat salaries I think they have to pay before the dollars make it to those communities to actually have an effect. So I understand up in the Ring of Fire area, way up in the north, we're going to hear more about the Ring of Fire probably in the coming years, because I know the province wants to get in there and try to extract all those toxic resources that will probably poison the waters and the lands. And they'll probably do it for as cheap as they can and screw the First Nations people there as much as they can so they don't get any wealth from it. And mark my words, that's probably what's going to happen. You don't hear about First Nations communities like Niskanja that's had the longest boil water advisory anywhere in Canada. I think they're in the thousands of days now that they've had boil water advisories. And you contrast that to last summer in Calgary. I know they had some water problems and had to boil water for a few weeks. It was in the news all the time. Or let's look at Halifax last summer. They had a boil water advisory for what, a couple of weeks? And people were up in arms. You know, why aren't the average Canadian folks up in arms for boil water advisories for our First Nations communities? You know, that would be reconciliation. It really would. It's a shame that the original peoples of this land, you know, had a lot of our land resources extracted from us. Or out from under us, and it's the average Canadians that benefit, whereas the First Nations folks are the ones that are still living in poverty and having to deal with the boil water advisories. So there's a real contrast among communities, and it's just a shame and a tragedy. So to answer your question about traditional medicines, in our garden at Hillcrest Park, we teach the men how to grow traditional plant medicines, and we teach them medicinal qualities of those things. So it can be something as simple as growing, let's see here, peppermint. You know, they'll grow peppermint leaves, and in the fall they'll harvest those plants and they'll let them dry. We'll bring in a herbologist who has that traditional knowledge about the healing qualities of that simple plant. And in the winter months, they'll come in and show them how to make different teas or different things out of those plants so that they can understand the healing properties of those things. I know how Western medicine, aspirin was created from the inner bark of the red willow shrubs, because a lot of Native people, I know when we used to have headaches and that sort of thing, you just scrape off the inner bark of that red willow and that would help relieve the headache. And that's one of the primary ingredients that you'd find in aspirin or Tylenol. So a lot of the Indigenous knowledge of the traditional plant medicine, you know, formed the basis for modern Western medicines.
Thank you.
Hi. Just wondering a little bit about the percentage of youth and children in the, facility. Can you, what's it called again? No, where you said there's so many beds at the facility where you are.
Oh, okay.
And also, I'm also just wondering if you know, or if you can help us learn a little bit about programming for youth and children. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, at NAMI Reds, our focus is primarily the men. So we don't necessarily focus on families or children. We do work with a few youth, although we don't target programs necessarily for youth. So there are other organizations that work with Indigenous youth. I know one of them and families, and one that works with all those groups is Native Child and Family Services. However, they're the Indigenous Child Welfare Agency in Toronto. So some people, based on historical issues, have difficulties sometimes seeking services from them, because you know, they have the power to take away your kids if you know, they think you're doing something wrong. So a lot of folks may not always go to those programs. I used to work for that place and run their youth program. And I know they have a youth shelter, as well as housing opportunities for a lot of Indigenous youth as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I see a question here.
Thanks. I would like to make a comment about the residential schools. My son-in-law was a Mountie, and he was stationed in Tuktoyaktuk and Aklavik and Delaney for 5 years, and I used to go twice a year, so I've experienced the summers and the winters up there and met a lot of the people, of course. And the people I met were very thankful for the residential schools. One woman said that she learned that there was more to life than following the caribou. And she was very grateful that she got an education and that the residential schools helped a lot of people. And I must say, as a sideline, my husband and I, as I say, used to go, and the Inuvialuit don't often laugh, but I still remember them laughing when my husband and I were trying to do the drum dancing. So they do have a sense of humor, and the residential schools did have a lot of worthwhile things about them. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think your comment would be that among the minority of Indigenous peoples that actually went to residential schools. And, it was the Mounties that enforced the unjust laws that the Indian Act contained to forcibly remove children from their homes, whether they wanted to or not. And if the parents resisted, the RCMP would arrest those parents and put them in jail for resisting taking away their own children. So it is, but it's part of our history. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm not disagreeing that the Mounties are important. However, they were put in a position where they had to enforce some unjust laws and remove children away from their loving parents and families. And I know my grandparents' experience with residential schools. They talked about the horrible times they experienced. Not many people from my community are still Catholics because of their experience in the residential school and the abuse they went through. No priests or nuns were ever arrested or brought to jail for the horrible treatment they did against young children. So, I'm glad the folks in Tuktoyaktuk had a good experience in the residential schools, and maybe perhaps there was no abuse which took place there. But I know my grandparents were beaten for speaking their language. They were beaten for just very simple things that you wouldn't hit your own children for. So I think that's among the minority of opinions of people that went to residential schools.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi. So where do you, your residents, get most of your funding from?
Well, we get our funding from a variety of places. I'd say our largest funder is the City of Toronto in funding the shelter beds. It's mainly the City of Toronto that's our biggest funder, although we do have some Indigenous funders as well. There is some homeless funding, and that comes through the Aboriginal Labour Force Development Circle, who administers that funding. Mm-hmm.
Stephen, you've been working hard here. I have a question that I think others may have as well, because right now in the news we hear a lot, not only about the encampments, but around addiction, safe places for, injection sites and so on. And there seems to be a lot of controversy around that, and people who somehow only, may see the dangers or the unsafety around for the communities around. I expect you probably encounter a lot of folks who are struggling that way. Any thoughts around that?
Well, I know around our provincial government wanting to close down a lot of the safe injection sites that are within, I think, 200 meters of either daycares or schools. It's sort of unfortunate. I recently read a report that in Vancouver and as well as in Alberta, the average life expectancy for Indigenous peoples has actually dropped. It's declined, and it's attributed to, among other things, the opioid crisis. I haven't seen data yet on Ontario, but personally, I've known lots of people that have died from overdoses. Our shelter is not a safe injection site. We follow an abstinence-based model where we encourage people not to use at all. But we know a significant segment of the folks we work with are active drug users. And I heard our premier on the news the other day talking about how he hears constituents always talking about, they take their children to a park and they find used needles. That's horrible. That shouldn't be the case. But I think the average constituents would be more appalled if they go to the park and they find used needles and users of drugs who passed away in the park, right? And I think that's what's going to happen when they close these safe injection sites, because with the supervised injection sites, it brings the people out of parks into places where they can use these illicit drugs and inject them safely, and with the supervision of health professionals, and it actually does prevent deaths. And if they build enough trust with those caregivers, it might help them when they're ready to leave those drugs behind. They'll have that relationship already, and they can help them along their path to maybe seeking out healing. So I think that proposed legislation is very ill-informed, and I think a lot of people are going to die as a result. Or on the lower end of the scale, I think it's going to criminalize a lot of people that are drug users and have severe addictions.
Thank you, Steve. There's always so many more questions, and I know for some folks, depending on their history, even understanding things like how intergenerational trauma and the effects of that, and how deep the wounds and the journey of healing. But thank you so much for the work that you do. It must be really difficult at times. It's frontline, dealing with a lot of pain, and also a lot of the wider, perspectives across Canada, and people who don't necessarily understand, and in some cases don't really sympathize either. Certainly, we've been trying to learn a lot, through books, through special guests, and hopefully that learning journey will continue for us as a community. But for Name Res, and this is a decision we have made through our outreach fund, we have a gift for you, and hopefully this will help for Christmas and for some of your programming. So thank you for being here.
Chimigwech, everybody, and again, thank you for being so welcoming. And
thank you everyone for coming, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just a very